Hi, class. I hope you are well. Welcome to Foundations of the Restoration. Today, we are going to talk about plural marriage. And last time, we talked about Nauvoo doctrines. Before we review, though, just really quick, I want to thank again Brother Scott Woodward, who gave me a good framework for this lesson. And if you want to know more, go to scottwoodward.org. You'll learn so much from his website. And I also want to thank Brian and Laura Hells, who have Joseph Smith, polygamy.org, excellent website for the resources that I received for this. And I want to ask you please, and I always ask this, but this time I really mean it because of the topic, because of what I'm going to cover. Please pray. Please open with the word of prayer and ask the Spirit to teach you and to testify to you. He is our comforter, but he's also, his central mission is to testify of truth, to testify that Jesus is the Christ, but to testify to us that the things that we hear are true. So if you'll do that, if you'll pause this video and then go do that, that'll be great. So, all right, well, you paused the video, you're back, you've prayed, so let's get going. Now, last time we talked about the Nauvoo doctrines, and if you recall, you can see there in the blue how many revelations the prophet Joseph Smith received before he went into Liberty Jail. And then after Liberty Jail, doesn't receive as many revelations, but starts to preach doctrines and theology and just really just pours it on and starts to really give these incredible doctrinal sermons. So that's what we focused on last time, those doctrines that he taught in the last years of his life, and what was one of the number one activities in Nauvoo in the last 2 years of Joseph Smith's life. It was baptisms for the dead. And we talked about the doctrine of celestial marriage and the doctrine of God's true nature. As God is, man may become as man is, God once was. Talked about the doctrine of our Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Parents and our divine potential. Talked about how there were intelligences, and the Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother organized those intelligences into a spirit body. They created an earth where that spirit body could come down and to enter into a mortal body. And then eventually after death, if they're receive all the ordinances, if they keep the commandments, and through the grace of Jesus Christ, they may receive eternal life. A couple, once they're married and sealed in the house of the Lord. And then they eventually, in eternity, will do what our heavenly parents do, and they will create worlds without end, and they will create and organize and bring intelligences into spirits, and we will do what they did. Well, that was last time. Today's lesson, these are the topics we're going to hit. Why did the Lord command plural marriage? Why has he always commanded it? Why did he command it to Abraham? Why did he command it to Jacob? Why did Joseph Smith have so many wives? Why were some of Joseph's wives married to other men for time? Why did Joseph have did Joseph have sexual relations with his plural wives? How do we reconcile that Joseph married a 14-year-old girl? Is plural marriage requisite for exaltation? Are there any secrets about plural marriage we don't know about today? Well, if last time I taught you the beautiful doctrines like the reality of Heavenly Mother, eternal marriage, today is the uncomfortable doctrines, right? No one seems to know quite how to talk about this. And a good question, why is plural marriage still such a challenging topic today? Brian Hales, Joseph Smith, polygamy.org, he says anytime you put sex and religion together, you got a hot button topic. It just becomes explosive. Sex plus religion becomes an easy anti-church target. And so our critics they jump all over that. So I really want to, today I want to teach you and inoculate you against a lot of the things that the critics will throw at us again and again, all the things that get thrown at you on the internet and everywhere else from friends and family. So there is a podcast called LDS Perspectives. And Daniel Peterson, this is titled Tough Questions About Mormon Polygamy. And he asks these questions to Laura and Brian Hells. And they're the ones that have josephsmithpolygamy.org. And Dan Peterson, when he's interviewing the two of them, and by the way, they are like resident experts. They are both scholars. They know, I want to say that Brian's actually an anesthetologist by trade, or I know he's a doctor, but his wife they're both, she's very scholarly. They're both, they know their stuff. And so, anyway, I rely heavily on them, on some of the things they say. But when Daniel's interviewing him, he's asked him a question. He says, why hasn't the church been more forthright about polygamy? And then Laura replies, she says, well, she said, there was an attitude among some of the brethren that it was better to keep some aspects of our prophets' lives private. So she quoted Ronald Walker as saying that when Leonard Arrington, he was a church historian in the 1970s, he was writing his biography on Brigham Young, and he was asked by one of the brethren to take out all the references to polygamy. They did, so they wanted to actually protect the prophets and their private lives. In the case of Brigham Young, she goes on to say, I don't really see the necessity of that because the whole world knows that Brigham Young was a polygamist. Because by the time he practiced polygamy, the Eastern press got a hold of it. It was, everybody knows Brigham Young had many wives. But even though most of us didn't know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and we did know that Brigham Young was a polygamist, one thing she points out is we didn't get this from church curriculum. This was kind of kept under the table, even though you could get it, you could find out about it, but it was, again, brethren just trying to just protect their private lives. And plus, some people just, unless they're willing to pay the price to know the doctrine behind it, at first glance, it could affect their testimony. And again, that's why one of the reasons I want to teach it to you. And so, and then Laura brings up a great point. She talks about a talk that was given by M. Russell Ballard at General Authority Night. I was there when this was given, and this is what M. Russell Ballard said. This is in 2016. He said, gone are the days when a student asked an honest question and a teacher responded, yeah, don't worry about it. Gone are the days when students raised a sincere question and a teacher bore his or her testimony, his or her testimony, as a response intended to avoid the issue. Gone are the days when students were protected from people who attacked the church. More than any time in our history, your students also need to be blessed by learning doctrinal or historical context and context by study and faith, accompanied by pure testimony, so they can experience a mature and lasting conversion to the gospel. We give medical inoculations to our precious missionaries before sending them into the mission field so they will be protected against disease that can harm or even kill them. In a similar fashion, please, before you send them into the world, inoculate your students by providing faithful, thoughtful, and accurate interpretation of gospel doctrine, the scriptures, our history, and those topics that are sometimes misunderstood. Well, Laura Hells says this was a watershed talk because in his talk, he admits that the well-meaning curriculum of the past does not meet the needs of you today, of young single adults like you today. And I agree with her. It really has changed. We've tried the church has tried to be as transparent as we can, and so do we. And so I try to teach students. I'm careful. I always try. I don't want to hurt them, but I want to help them, and I want to build their faith. So these are the questions that I want to answer. And you see that one or two, there's actually about three or four of them I'm not going to answer today for time's sake. But let's just jump right in because I want to make sure I don't want to go over, and I want to see if I can get to the questions that I will answer. So when did Joseph first learn about plural marriage? What was the reaction? Well, boom. So the church is organized in 1830. A year later, 1831, Orson Pratt says the time had not come to teach or practice it, but he knew it. Why? How did he know about it? Because he's revising the Bible. He's in the book of Genesis. He's reading about Jacob and all his wives, and he's like, and Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and he's like asking questions. And so the Lord revealed it to him, but it wasn't time to teach it. So as you can see, very early on, he learns about plural marriage. He actually will not receive the revelation on plural marriage until, as you can see, till between 1843 and 1844, so just before he was martyred. And so Lucy Walker, one of his plural wives, says Joseph had his doubts about it, for he debated it in his own mind. Eliza R. Snow, one of his wives, very articulate, she said Joseph was afraid to promulgate it. He knew the voice of God. He knew the commandment of the Almighty to him was to go forward. Yet the prophet hesitated and deferred from time to time until an angel of God stood by him with a drawn sword and said, "You'll be destroyed, Joseph." And there are others. Mary Elizabeth Leitner said, an angel came to him, and the last time came with a drawn sword. So first 2 times, no sword. Third time, sword in his hand. Joseph practiced plural marriage, or you will be destroyed. And the angel came to me. Now, this is important. I want you to remember this, okay? Because it's going to help you. This is going to help understand why Joseph practices plural marriage, then stops, and then starts again. So the angel came to me, he says, 3 times between the years of 1834 and 1842, and said I was to obey that principle or he would slay me. And again, Erastus Snow said, Joseph pled on his knees before the angel for his life. So the angel was kind of upset, apparently, and Joseph feared for his life. Well, what was the Lord's doctrinal explanation for plural marriage? One of the things that Laura Held says, she says, if I were to stand on a street corner, say in Manhattan, New York, and just say, hey, Joseph Smith, if I stood up on a box and yelled out to the people that right there at Times Square and introduced polygamy and said, Joseph Smith introduced polygamy among our church members. Why do you think he did that? Well, every person that don't know anything about it, they'll probably say, well, he wanted sex. Well, they aren't going to say, well, I bet he was a prophet restoring Old Testament polygamy that was practiced by many of the ancient prophets in the Old Testament. They're not going to say that. That's not going to occur to them. So when people say this or think this or allege this, that Joseph just had an active libido, we're not surprised. But it's important for us who believe to understand what Joseph taught and why the Lord pushed plural marriage at different time periods in history of the earth. So let's take a look. So 4 reasons. The first one, we're going to look at section 132. Why? Because it was a test, just plain right out. It was the Lord's testing his children. Go ye therefore and do, by the way, just like in Genesis 22, where it says literally the Lord said he was going to test Abraham to try to prove him, to see what he's made of, and to help Abraham to realize what he's made of. But I like it, verse 32. It says, go ye therefore and do the works of Abraham. Again, this is section 132 given in the last year of the Joseph Smith's life. It's the revelation. First half of it is on celestial marriage. Second half is on plural marriage. But the Lord says, why? Why this law? I, the Lord, commanded it. And then he goes on to say, Joseph, I've seen your sacrifices. I've seen your sacrifices in obedience to that which I told you. As I accepted the offering of Abraham of his son Isaac. And then he says, for I did it, saith the Lord. Why did I want you to practice plural marriage? Same reason I wanted Abraham to test same reason I asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. For I did it, end of verse 51, saith the Lord, to prove you all as I did Abraham, that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice. Brigham Young said when he first learned about plural marriage in Nauvoo, he said, when he sees a funeral going by and a casket going by, and he says, when I saw the funeral, I envy the corpse situation and to regret that I was not in that coffin. So here's the second reason. Because the Lord says in that section 132 again, he says, I give unto thee, Joseph, an appointment to restore all things, all doctrines, that which was taught to Jacob and to Abraham and to Isaac, yeah, and different. And I restore all things, verse 45. And in fact, Paul and Luke tells us that uh, whom the heaven must, Jesus Christ, whom the heaven must receive until, in other words, Savior's going to stay in heaven until the heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things. So Joseph was a prophet restorer, and he restored it. He restored this doctrine again. More importantly, though, what Joseph is really restoring is eternal marriage. It was the quintessential doctrine. Through eternal marriage, we can, and when I say eternal marriage, I'm not saying plural marriage. I'm referring eternal marriage between a husband and a wife. Through eternal marriage, that's how we become exalted, because we become like God the Father and our Heavenly Mother. Plural marriage is merely a component, a practice of eternal marriage, but not always essential, as I'll talk about later. So, third reason, simply to multiply and replenish the earth. In fact, the Lord told Jacob, he said, "For there shall not any man among you save it be one wife. For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people." You know, critics against our church will often say, "Man, those members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they contradict themselves. And Joseph did one thing, but his Book of Mormon taught another." For whatever reason, the Lord commanded Abraham, commanded Jacob, commanded other ancient prophets to practice plural marriage. But for the Nephites and the Lamanites in the New World, the Lord said in the Book of Mormon, no. For whatever reason, he's like, I don't want you to practice plural marriage, and we don't know why. And so, yeah. So, does plural marriage work in bringing, populating the earth? Absolutely. As you can see by Joseph F. Smith's family, it increased the birth of large numbers of people, but also marriage became available virtually to all who desired it. Per capita inequality of wealth was diminished as economically disadvantaged women, they married into financially stable households, so it kind of spread the wealth. And if we were together as a class, I would say, how many of you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a plural marriage? And I find that usually it's about a third of all my students. And those of you that would raise your hand, you're evidence of the good that came from this doctrine. And then the last point I would make, why plural marriage? Why did Joseph marry? And this will add, and this is part of answering the question, why did Joseph marry so many wives? Why were so many people getting married? The saints, at least in part, misunderstood D&C 132, at least the first half of it. They thought you had to be sealed to a spouse in this life or you don't get exalted in the next. In other words, you had to do it now while you were still alive. In fact, in section 132, this is how this verse 15, it says, this is how it was interpreted by many. If a man marry him, I call this a in the world marriage. If a man marry him a wife in the world, in other words, just a marriage down at the peace, justice of peace, and not in the house of the Lord, not in the temple. And he marry her not by me, nor by my word, verse 16. Therefore, when they are out of the world, they're appointed angels in heaven. And it says in verse 17, they will remain separately and singly without exaltation in their safe condition. When my roommates and I were in our 30s and not married, we used to joke, I guess I'm just going to be a ministering angel. Well, what they didn't realize, the saints in Joseph Smith's day didn't realize, was that if you didn't have an opportunity to have a celestial marriage in this life, God would give you a chance in the millennium to marry somebody. And this wasn't taught in Nauvoo. And so that's why a 56-year-old woman asked Joseph Smith to marry her so she could receive exaltation. And verses 19 to 20 after these verses go on to say that, that if you're sealed to someone, you will be exalted if you're sealed in the house of the Lord. But it isn't necessarily, it tells us the why, but not necessarily the how. So But you and I know now today that if we never had a chance to get married in this life, we'll get the chance in the next life during the millennium, right? So here are the four reasons that I throw out to you, and maybe there's other, but these are the only four that I know. So who was Joseph's first plural wife? Well, remember the little gray dot. Joseph learns about plural marriage as he's revising Genesis in 1831. 1834, he marries Fanny Alger. Why did he marry Fanny Alger? Remember I told you the angel came three times between 1834 and 1842? And when did he marry Fanny Alger? Right about the time the first angel came. And that's one of our hypotheses is Joseph's like, okay, angel said I need to do this, so I'm going to do it. Well, who is Fanny? She's a 19, 20-year-old housemaid in the Smith home. Emma's very fond of her. When did they marry? Between 1834 and 1836. Levi Hancock, her uncle, performed it. Emma will struggle with it, and eventually she pushes her out of the house, says, "You're not staying in here." And Emma will struggle with plural marriage to the very end, and rightly so. I mean, it's difficult. It was difficult for Abraham and Sarah. It was difficult for Jacob. It's a difficult doctrine to live. So why was there such a long period? So he took his first wife, he took Fanny in 1834. And then if you look at the time period, so it was around, again, I said 1834, but it could have been it was somewhere around 1834, 1836. And then he doesn't take another wife until 1841. But remember, the angels came between 1834 and 1841, 1842. So what we're thinking is that's why he finally marries Joseph marries Louisa Beeman, his second plural wife. And again, because the angel, we think, the second angel must have came about 1841. So he marries her. How many wives did Joseph have? Well, the answer is about 35. Now, Brian Hells at josephsmithpolygamy.org will say, by my count, there was 35. Laura, his wife, he says, I think discounts a couple of them, so maybe 33. But I'm just going to go with, I'll just go with 35. And why were some of Joseph's plural wives already married to other men? So Joseph was sealed to 14 other women. And here, these are the women, 14 women that had husbands. And he will marry these women for eternity. That you could be married for time and eternity, meaning, you live together, you're intimate together, or you're just married for eternity, meaning that, there was no intimacy in the marriage. But as you can see, these are the lists of the wives' husbands. I don't know if you need to see that, but why would he marry women who were already married for time? Why would he get married to these women for eternity if they were already married for time to these men? Well, let me give you a doctrinal reason, situational reason, and an emotional one. So doctrinal reason. So remember, the saints are interpreting first half of section 132, D&C 132, that to get exalted, you had to have a celestial marriage. And some faithful, active women were married to non-member, inactive, faithless men. So they're like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get into the celestial kingdom unless somebody marries me. Joseph, will you marry me? Being sealed to Joseph as plural wives for eternity only would allow all worthy women to be sealed to an eternal husband. And they thought, man, if I could be married to anybody, I would want to be married to a prophet of God. And I have a little note here. Marriage sealings for the dead who were not members was not yet part of the theological picture. Hence the urgency for these women to receive this ordinance in this life. So, situational reason. Some of the women chose Joseph rather than their legal husband to be with eternity. For example, Ruth Vos Sayers. She was married to Mr. Sayers, and this is what she wrote. This is what's written in her biography at the bottom. Mr. Sayers, not attaching much importance to the theory of future life, insisted that his wife Ruth should be sealed to the prophet for eternity, that he himself should only claim her in this life. So she was accordingly sealed to the prophet in Emma Smith's presence. So Mr. Sayer is saying, you know what? I'm not really too worried about a future life. I don't really quite believe in it. I don't think there's life after death. I don't apparently didn't believe there was a God. So he's like, you know what? If you believe in it and you feel like you need to be married and to get to heaven and back to your God, then go ahead, marry Joseph. Emotional reason. Perhaps Joseph preferred this approach. When I say this approach, being married to these married women just for eternity, not for time, meaning there's no sexual relations. It allowed him to be obedient to the commandment that the angel gave, right? While essentially guaranteeing there would be no sexuality into the relationship. And perhaps when he married Louisa Beeman, maybe it opened up all the emotional wounds when he married Fanny Alger back in 1834, because Emma really had a hard time with that. And perhaps Joseph resolved to go about it this way in order just to avoid such emotional weight going forward. So, and also, again, the absence of sexuality in these sealings would provide emotional protection for Joseph and Emma's relationship, because to him that was extremely important. He loved her dearly, wrote many beautiful letters to her. 8 of his next 9 proposals are to women who are already married. And so I wanted to make that point. So if the angel came that second time, so he's like, okay, so I've got to start marrying, I've got to have plural marriage like Abraham, like Jacob. So he starts again, but he's like, well, why don't I marry these women and just for eternity? But then, so before we press the scandal button, let me just say something we need to consider, and I love this point that Brother Woodward makes. None of these women ever complained. None of their husbands ever complained. None of the witnesses made protests about it. None of the apostates in Nauvoo ever brought up anything about this up in their anti-Mormon attacks. But now, but again, it's a silver bullet, a criticism that people use to defame the prophet Joseph Smith. And so we might be I think, to postpone criticism until we're able to understand these plural marriage. But let me just say this, but this eternity-only approach to marriage, it didn't last long. Remember, there were 3 times the angel came, and the last time the angel came with a drawn sword, and probably the angel appears right here, and perhaps the angel comes to say, Joseph, that eternity marriage thing, that's not what I asked you to do. So between 1842 and 1843, he will start to marry women for time as well. And sexuality is documented with 9 of them. So which brings up the next question: was Joseph physically intimate with his plural wives? And the answer is, well, there's at least 3 of them that there's strong evidence, absolutely. Then the rest and then you see about 4 or 5 there are moderate, 6, and then 2 of them are weak, and then the rest of them is just little or none evidence. Emily Partridge, the first one, the reason we know we have strong evidence, she was in the Temple Lot case. That was the court case between the Hedrickites and the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ, the Community of Christ Church. And they were arguing over who had right to this certain piece of property. And so Lucy Walker in the Temple, Emily Partridge, the court, I guess it was the judge, as I read the court proceedings, I think it was the judge. I don't know if it was a prosecuting attorney or whatever, but he says, did you have intimacy with Joseph Smith? And she says, yes. And then Lucy Walker, the second one, she also was in the Temple Lot case. And the judge asked her if she lived with Joseph Smith. And she said, he was my husband, sir. And then he asked, did you ever occupy the same bed with him? And she answered, I declined to answer that question. So interesting. At one point she says yes, one point she says I decline. So, and there were other sources, however, that corroborate. Let me just say one thing about Lucy too. She said I declined to answer that, but there were other sources that corroborate that she did have conjugal relations with Joseph Smith. In fact, in the Temple Lot case, she'll go on to say she was with him. They said, so were you with him in a room? Did you sleep with him in a room? She says, yes. They said, where? In the Nauvoo mansion. And the judge kept asking her, how many times were you with him in a room alone at night? And she said, well, I can't tell you. I think I've acted the part of a lady in answering you questions as well as I have. And I don't think you're acting the part of a gentleman in asking me these questions. So good for her. Yeah. Did he have children with any of these women? Mary Elizabeth Leitner, one of his wives, she says, I don't know about having children, but I heard of 3 that he was the father of. Now, there have been 20 claims of children. 8 of these are solid claims. These have been DNA tested and all come back negative. So how did he propose to his various wives? I'm going to skip this question for time's sake. How did Emma? You go to Joseph Smith, polygamy.org. You'll find out. How did Emma Smith feel about and deal with plural marriage? Boom. It was her Abrahamic test. Besides her first marriage, his first marriage to Fanny Alger in 1834, she was unaware of any of Joseph's other marriages until 1843, the last year of his life. And Emma struggled mightily to accept the doctrine. And in May 1843, Emma gave Joseph 4 wives, the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters. And Joseph Lee Robinson writes, he says, there was a time when Emma became very angry and said she would leave and was making preparations to go to her people in the state of New York. It came close to breaking up his family. So yeah, she really struggles with it. And she briefly accepts the principle, and she gives Joseph 4 wives. And I want to say that was the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters. And then almost immediately she rejects it, becomes very bitter. And then Joseph in November 1843 does not enter into any more plural marriages. Well, when Joseph received Section 142, when he and Emma, I'm sorry, Section 1, they say 142. I was looking at one of these dates. Section 132 on celestial marriage and plural marriage. He receives it in the presence of Hiram Smith, and Hiram takes it to Emma and reads it to her because Hiram says, I know she'll accept this, and she did, and she about killed him. In fact, she made him, luckily there was a copy made because she made him burn it, according to one account I read. And then the next day, Joseph and Emma finally came to an agreement. And it was, the first one was Joseph he had to ask Emma before he married anybody else. And secondly, Joseph promised Emma she would have financial support, and probably to assuage her fears that the other wives would end up robbing her of her inheritance when he died. And he will die in less than a year later. So the day after Hiram read D&C 132 to Emma about celestial marriage and plural marriage, William Clayton said, this morning, meaning this morning, Joseph sent for me. When I arrived, he called me up to his private room with Emma there and stated an agreement they had mutually entered in. And then 2 days later, William Clayton, after that was Section 132 was read to her and they had a big falling out, William Clayton said, I was called back to Joseph Smith and Emma. He said, I made a deed for half the steamboat Maid of Iowa from Joseph to Emma. So she inherits half the Maid of Iowa, and also 60 city lots were deeded to her so that she wouldn't have to worry about financial difficulties if Joseph died. So why did Joseph marry some women without Emma knowing about it? So if Section 132, you read, I'm just going to let you read this on your own, but verse 64 and 65, there's some strong language here that if a woman were taught this doctrine and then she rejects it when God asked her to live it, she could be destroyed. meaning spiritually destroyed. And maybe he wanted to exempt Emma from this. We don't really know, but perhaps he never explains a whole doctrine to her, thinking him to himself, if I explain everything to Emma, it might condemn her. And so that's one hypothesis that we have. Now, this is what critics hit us with really hard in our church. And why did Joseph marry a 14-year-old girl? Well, here's the woman that was 14-year-old, one of the young women that he married. So it's Helen Marr. So let's ask her. Why did you marry a man at 14 years old? Well, she says, and she wrote a lot about this. She's written more about her plural marriage to Joseph Smith than anybody else. She said, my dad, Heber C. Kimball, taught me the principle of celestial marriage, and having a great desire to be connected with the prophet Joseph, he offered me to him. And now, so she'll live to be very old, and she'll give us a lot of information. And so, as you can see here, her dad actually is the one that set this up. And it wasn't Joseph who was pursuing the 14-year-old, but Heber C. Kimball is one that he sets it up, and Helen agrees, his daughter, and Joseph agrees, and then there was a sealing. And the evidence is pretty clear it was not consummated. Thus, it was a betrothal rather than a marriage. And in Utah, once the saints move out to Utah and practice plural marriage, there is a policy that if you married a young girl like Helen Marr at 14 years old, there was a policy not to consummate the marriage to the younger wives until they were about 18 or 19 years old. And while it's impossible to document it, it appears this policy began in Nauvoo with the prophet Joseph Smith. So he's the one that first taught it. Now, let me just say something about this. The average age in the U.S. during the 19th century for a woman was 20 years old. The legal age of consent in the U.S. at the time was much younger. Illinois, for example, you could marry at 10 years old. So I wanted to show you this graph of age of husband and wives that marriage for LDS Nauvoo era civil marriages. So you can see they're right about between 19 and 21 years old. That's the average age. So marrying a 14-year-old is not the average. It's a little uncommon, but it did happen. So I like how Gregory Smith deals with this. He says this was simply part of the environment and culture. It's unfair to judge 19th century members by 21st century social standards. He goes on to say, Joseph Smith's polygamous marriages to young women may seem difficult to understand or explain today, but in his own time, such age differences were not typically an obstacle to marriage. The plural marriages were unusual, to say the least. The younger ages of the brides were much less so. Critics do not provide this perspective because they wish to shock the audience and to have them judge Joseph by the standards of the modern era rather than his own time. And so a fact stripped of its context can be like an electrical wire stripped of its protective rubber sheath. It's quite shocking when you come into contact with it. So what do anti-church people say about Joseph Smith marrying 14-year-old without, they'll say it without context. And yeah, it's shocking. And some might say, well, why would Helen Marr's dad, Heber C. Kimball, consent for his daughter to marry an older man like that? Well, in a book Helen Marr Kimball writes in the 1880s called A Woman's View, she wrote a bunch of other articles too, besides the book, but she attributed Heber C. Kimball's desire for her to be married to Joseph as a desire to bind their families together for eternity. So Heber C. Kimball, he wanted a kind of dynastic connection to the prophet Joseph Smith. He loved Joseph, and he wanted this binding link. Well, some people will criticize this because they'll say, well, that's evidence that she didn't really realize what she was getting into. Well, Helen admitted herself she didn't understand what she was getting into. But later in life, she didn't have a problem with the sealing. And again, not again, but this is what we call the problem of presentism. Again, presentism is where our attitudes towards the past is dominated by our present day attitude and experiences. We use our modern day standards to judge standards of the past. And it would be a little on the young side to marry at 14 years old, but not unheard of. It wasn't. It's not underage. Or illegal in some countries even today. And in fact, my grandmother was 15 years old when she was married. My great grandmother, she was 15 years old as well. And and everything Helen Marr ever wrote, I like what Laura Held says. You won't find anywhere that she was ever alone with Joseph Smith without a chaperone. And even after they're sealed to each other, she goes to dances for 6 months after she's married to Joseph Smith, suggesting that she never really even considered herself married. And there's little note in her autobiography where she describes her experience to her children. I love this. So Laura Hale shares this too in her interview with Daniel Peterson. She signs this letter she's written to them, and she goes back and overwrites Smith. So she eventually married, after Joseph died at 16 years old, she marries Horace Whitney. So just before she dies, though, she overwrites Smith before her last name, Whitney. And Laura says to me that's kind of an acceptance of that binding that she did with Joseph. And in fact, she'll never blame mom and dad for marrying her to Joseph. She had plenty of years to do that. She loved her parents her whole life. She didn't judge them for it. And for us to judge them, we really, as Laura Hell would say, we need to think twice about that. So here's the big question that students always ask me. Is plural marriage a requirement for exaltation? Well, if you read section 132, again, the first half of section 132 it's written about celestial marriage. That's the core doctrine there. It's not, now later, about verse 34-ish, 30-ish, 30, somewhere in the 30s, it'll start to talk specifically about plural marriage. But in the beginning, it's talking about the importance of being married by the Lord in His way, in His place, at His time. That's essential, absolutely essential. So is plural marriage a requirement for exaltation? No, but getting married in the house of the Lord to one person, yes, it is. And the interview with Brian and Laura Hales, they say there is no record of Joseph Smith or any other priesthood leader stating that all exalted men are polygamists. However, statements, and they make this point though, there are statements between 1852 and 1890 that you can proof text. You could pull out of journal discourses and quote that one statement out of context to make it seem like, yeah, you have to be married, have plural marriage to be exalted. And fundamentalists who broke away from our church who are practicing plural marriage, they do that. And so, but there's no record that Joseph, other priesthood leaders taught that. So did Joseph ever teach plural marriage was essential for exaltation? I like what Wilford Woodruff said. He said, now I should back up and say, during the Temple Lot depositions taken in 1892, he was there too. And he was asked if Joseph had ever taught, they said, did Joseph ever teach you at Nauvoo or anywhere else during his lifetime that in order for a man to be exalted in the hereafter, he must have more than one wife? And then Wilford Woodruff said, I don't know that I ever heard him make use of that expression or use that form of expression. And the court asked a third witness named Joseph Kingsbury, and he replies, no, sir, he did not teach me that. He did not say anything about that. I heard it preached from the stand that a man can be exalted in eternity with one wife. And Harold B. Lee said a man can be exalted with one wife. President Wilford, again, Woodruff, a man may embrace the law of celestial marriage in his heart and not take the second not wife and be justified before the Lord. So, question 14. Are those who married in plural marriage situation in this life going to be with their spouse in the next life? Lucy Walker Smith, Joseph, one of Joseph's wives, said he told her a woman would have her choice. This was a privilege that could not be denied her. Why can men still be sealed to more than one wife today if the first wife is deceased, but women can't be sealed to more than one husband under the same circumstances? She actually can, but the caveat is she must be dead first. So why this is, I don't know. But if your great-great-grandmother had 5 husbands in her life, and she's not sealed to any of them, you get to seal her to all of them. And then she gets to choose her favorite one. But a woman has to be dead to be sealed to more than one. Question 16. In the next life, will a man be with his first wife who has died and his second wife to whom he was later sealed? If so, what if the first wife doesn't want that? And what if is God going to put 2 people together that maybe they didn't get along? Maybe the wife doesn't want to be with them. I like what Joseph F. Smith said. If a man and woman should be joined together who are incompatible to each other, it would be a mercy to them to be separated, that they might have a chance to find other spirits that will be congenial to them. We may bind on earth and it will be bound in heaven, and loose on earth and it will be loosed in heaven. I always tell my students, remember, the sealing power is not more powerful than God himself. If some reason 2 couples, maybe you sealed your grandmother to 5 different people, and one of them, the husband says to God, I really want her, but she doesn't really want that one. God's not going to he's not going to take her, rob her of her agency. She's going to get to make the choice, just like she would in this life. God is perfectly fair. He is, we talk about he's perfectly loving, perfectly gracious, perfectly kind, all these great attributes, character, perfections, and attributes. But one of them is God is perfectly fair. And whatever is fair, if it doesn't seem fair to you, it's not going to be fair to God. As you know, Dallin H. Oaks lost his first wife, married again, was sealed to another woman. He said a lot of people, myself included, are in multiple marriage situations. For people who live in the belief, as I do, that marriage relations can be for eternity, then you must say, well, what will life be in the next life when you're married to more than one wife for eternity? And he says, I don't know. Am I going to have a celestial home with 2 wives? I don't know. I don't know how the Lord's going to work that all out. So, are there any secrets, Brother Castillow, about polygamy that if church members, if you knew, that I would leave the church? Well, let me just tell you, and I've tried my best to give you all, as Brother Woodward would say, the dirty laundry with all the context. You now know all the reasons that bother most people. Don't want to say all the reasons, but you know the biggest reasons that bother people and the context behind them. So what are the most trustworthy resources out there for me to study more about plural marriage? Well, I would say go to Gospel Topic Essays at the church website. Just type in Gospel Topic Essays, and within them you'll find one of the essays on plural marriage. It's really good. fairmormon.org. And then, and fairmormon.org is a bunch of scholars that it's very excellent resource to go to find a lot of answers on a lot of difficult questions. My favorite, though, is josephsmithpolygamy.org with Brian and Laura Hell. They did an excellent job. They've done their homework. They've done their research. And when Elder Ballard talked to us, religious educators, he said, for heaven's sake, teach the students about the challenges they face when they're relying upon the internet to answer questions of eternal significance. He said, remind them that James did not say, if any of you lack wisdom, let him Google. So yeah, don't go to if you just go to Google, you're going to go to our enemies. You're going to go to those that hate us. And that's not how you learn. I would say, if you're going to learn about any religion, whether you learn about Islam or you learn about Jehovah's Witness or you learn about Baptists, don't go to their enemies. Go to them. Go to the Jehovah's Witness and ask them, what do you teach? Listen to them and listen to what they say. So if we were together, I would say, what questions have we missed? Is there anything that you want to know? Here's my question to you. How are you going to explain all this to your anti-church cousin? And they're going to say that this is polygamy stuff's going to get thrown at you. Can I just say that actually, usually those people are the most difficult people to talk to about this. They, at least people, especially, I want to say, especially people that are in our church and have left our church. They've already made up their mind. They think they know Joseph's motives, and usually no amount of presenting historical sources will change their mind. So I'm interested in teaching you, in teaching those who are sincere and just want to know the truth. And I'm more interested in preventing people from going down a spiritually dangerous path because of misinformation. And so I like what Elder Neil A. Anderson says. He says, there will be family members and friends who will need your help. Now's the time to prepare to help others who are seeking the truth. And he said so I, brothers and sisters, I would throw out to you, so please come to know this doctrine, come to know how to teach it. Go read it for yourself, study it for yourself, know it. And, Blaise Pascal, who was he was a French mathematician, physicist, inventor, writer, Catholic theologian. He said, does God exist or not? He says, you must wager. He says, it's not optional. Which will you choose then? Let us weigh and gain the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. And he uses mathematical a way of, I don't know if this is mathematical, it's called a Punnett square. But he says, okay, and by the way, I'm going to come back and help connect this to plural marriage, okay? But he says, so look at the Punnett square. Do I believe in God? Well, if he exists, that's infinitely good. Well, if he doesn't exist, it's about even. Doesn't really matter, does it? But if I don't believe in God and God does exist, he look at the quadrant, he says, that's infinitely bad. If I don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, it's about even. Doesn't really matter, does it? Well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to say, is the church true or not? I'm going to change this up a little bit. Is Joseph Smith a prophet of God or not? Is the Book of Mormon true or not? Is this a big scam or is it not? Did God really restore to the prophet Joseph Smith plural marriage? Did he call Joseph to be a prophet of God? Did he or did he not? Well, if I believe it's true and it is true, it's infinitely good because I'm following God. He has restored the Church of Jesus Christ in the last days, and I am a part of it. If it's not true, it doesn't really matter, does it? Anyways, if I don't believe in it's true and I don't follow Jesus Christ and I don't keep my covenants and I don't learn the truths, it could be infinitely bad. And not just in the next life, in this life. Because the church teaches so many good truths, just like other Christian churches do. But our church teaches all the truths. If the church is not true, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? Well, in conclusion, Brian Hales says that, again, he's the author of him and his wife, Joseph Smith, polygamy.org. He says, and I like what he says. He says, he reads the scripture by Paul. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. And he says, I think, okay, if you have faith in the God of the Bible, if you believe in any of the Bible, then you should believe in that too, which is that whatever the next life is like, it's going to be so good that none of the grievances we can imagine will be worth anything compared to the blessings we'll receive. And if you believe that, you don't need to worry. You may not know how it'll all work out. You may not know what it'll be like, but you don't need to worry. It'll be fine. In fact, not just fine, he says, it'll be way beyond fine. It will be incomprehensible. I bear witness to you that God lives. And people, people that struggle with the prophet that say, your church, it's the fact that you have plural marriage, had plural marriage in your church is evidence and proof that it is a false church, it is a cult. Well, would those same people say that about Abraham? Would they say that about Jacob or the other prophets that had more than one wife in the Bible? I don't think so. But we have to remember that there are times when God has commanded it. In Jesus' day, plural marriage wasn't performed. It wasn't, that doctrine wasn't put on the earth. In the Book of Mormon, in their continent, there was no plural marriage. But there are time periods where the Lord has brought it back to the earth. Why, we don't know all the reasons. We know a couple of reasons. I shared 4 of maybe why I asked Joseph Smith to perform, to have plural marriages and the other saints. But I just want you to know that I know that Jesus Christ has restored this church through the prophet Joseph Smith. I know he's a prophet. When I read the Book of Mormon and I read beautiful scriptures in here, whether it's the Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants, I read it and I feel the power of the Holy Ghost bear witness to me that what I read is so beautiful and eloquent and true and doctrinally correct. In fact, I was reading the other day in Alma chapter 7, where it said that Jesus shall go forth suffering pains and afflictions and temptations of every kind, and this that the word might be fulfilled, which saith he will take upon him the pains and sicknesses of his people, that he might take upon him death, that he might loose the bands of death, that he might take upon their infirmities, and that his bowels may be filled with mercy according to the flesh, that he may know according to the flesh how to succor his people according to their needs. Now the Spirit knoweth all things. As I was reading those verses, and I read other verses that are just so beautiful, and teach me deep doctrines about the atonement or about purpose of life or resurrection, I just know Joseph Smith's a prophet. And you can know for yourself. So if you struggle, just put these things in the back of your mind and go forward. Have faith in Jesus Christ. He lives. I bear witness of that. And I bear witness that he has restored this church through our prophet today. And I'm so grateful for Jesus Christ. I'm so grateful for him. I love him with all my heart. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.